The studio was roaring with laughter. Steve Harvey was doing what he does best, tossing out one-liners, working the crowd, riding that perfect wave of comedic timing that had made him a household name. The lights were bright, the families were competitive, and everything was going exactly as scripted. Until it wasn't. Because in the span of 3 seconds, an elderly woman standing at the podium said 7 words that stopped everything. The laughter died. The cameras kept rolling, but the operators forgot they were supposed to be working. Steve Harvey, the man who had hosted thousands of episodes, who had seen every kind of answer, every type of contestant, who prided himself on never breaking character, stood completely still. His microphone dropped to his side. His mouth opened slightly, but no joke came out. For the first time in his career, Steve Harvey had nothing to say. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Something that would remind everyone watching why television, at its best, isn't about games or prizes or ratings. It's about the moment when one human being sees another human being, truly sees them, and everything else falls away. This is that story. And what happened next changed not just that episode, but Steve Harvey himself. If you want to understand how a simple game show moment became one of the most powerful things ever broadcast on television, subscribe now. Because what you're about to witness goes far beyond entertainment. It was a Tuesday afternoon taping at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. The kind of day that had become routine for Steve Harvey after years of hosting. 2 families, both excited, both prepared, both convinced they knew America better than the other team. The energy in the room was exactly what producers wanted, competitive, loud, fun. The Johnsons versus the Washingtons. Standard setup. Steve did his opening, got his laughs, introduced both families with his signature style, mixing humor with just enough heart to make them feel special. The game started normally. Question after question, the board revealed answers, points accumulated, and Steve worked his magic in between, turning ordinary moments into comedy gold. But there was something different about one member of the Washington family. An elderly woman, maybe 78, maybe 82, it was hard to tell. She stood at the end of the line, smallest in stature but somehow carrying a presence that the cameras kept drifting back to. Her name was Dorothy Washington, though everyone called her Miss Dot. She hadn't said much during the introductions. While her children and grandchildren had been animated, excited, talking over each other about their strategy and their love for the show, Miss Dot had simply smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. The kind that comes from someone who has lived long enough to understand that some moments don't need words. Steve noticed her, of course. He notices everyone. It's part of his gift. During a commercial break, he walked over, did what he always does, made her laugh, asked her about her family, kept the energy light. She had thanked him, told him he reminded her of someone, but didn't elaborate. Steve had moved on, not thinking much of it. He'd heard that before. He reminded a lot of people of someone. The game continued. Fast money round was approaching. The Washingtons were in the lead, and the energy was building toward that final crescendo that every episode needs. But then came the question that changed everything. Name something you do every single day without fail. Simple question. Standard Family Feud fare. The kind of prompt that usually generates answers like brush teeth, check phone, drink coffee. Easy. Predictable. Safe. The first few family members gave exactly those answers. The board revealed them one by one. Ding. 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 Steve made jokes, the audience laughed, everything was flowing. And then it was Miss Dot's turn. She stepped up to the podium slowly. Not from frailty, but from thoughtfulness. She placed her hands on the buzzer, looked up at Steve with those eyes that had seen decades of life, decades of loss, decades of love, and she spoke clearly. I pray for the man who killed my son. Time stopped. Not metaphorically. Literally. The entire studio seemed to inhale at once and forget to exhale. The laughter that had been bouncing off the walls moments before evaporated into a silence so profound that the hum of the stage lights became audible. Steve Harvey froze. His hand, which had been gesturing toward the board, hung in midair. His smile, the one he could maintain through anything, vanished. He turned slowly, fully, toward Miss Dot, and for the first time in 20 years of hosting this show, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. The producers in the booth didn't cut away. They should have. Protocol said to cut, regroup, maybe edit it out later. But something told them to keep rolling. The camera operators, trained to stay detached, to focus on their shots, found their own hands trembling slightly as they kept Miss Dot in frame. Steve took a step closer to her. Then another. The microphone in his hand wasn't for comedy anymore. It was just a tool to let her be heard. Say that again, he said quietly. Not for the audience. Not for the show. For himself. Because he needed to make sure he had heard correctly. Miss Dot's voice didn't waver. Every night, for the last 12 years, I pray for the man who took my son from me. I pray that he finds peace. I pray that he finds forgiveness. I pray that one day, he knows he's loved by God, even if he can't love himself. The silence in the studio was now complete. 200 people, and not one of them moved. Steve Harvey, the man who fills every silence with humor, with wisdom, with noise, stood there and let the quiet hold space for what he was hearing. Behind the scenes, every producer was making a decision that would define their careers. Keep rolling. Don't cut. The world needs to see this. Steve's eyes were no longer those of a host. They were the eyes of a father, a man, a human being confronting something he didn't understand but deeply, instinctively respected. He stepped even closer to Miss Dot, close enough that the microphone barely mattered. How? He asked. Not how do you do it every day. Not how is that your answer. Just how. How does a human heart do that? Miss Dot's face softened even further. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she smiled through it. Because hate is heavy, Steve. And I'm too old to carry it anymore. My boy wouldn't want me to carry it. So I put it down. And I picked up prayer instead. The audience, which had been holding its collective breath, released it in a wave of emotion that wasn't applause, wasn't cheers, but something deeper. A sound of recognition. Of shared humanity. Of people witnessing something sacred in the middle of something ordinary. Steve Harvey did something then that no host is supposed to do. He turned off his microphone. He handed it to a nearby producer. And he stepped fully away from the game, away from the cameras, and he stood in front of Miss Dot as just Steve. Not the comedian. Not the host. Just a man. I don't know if I could do that, he said, his voice thick. I don't know if I'm that strong. Miss Dot reached out and took his hand. Hers was small, weathered, marked by decades of work and time. His was larger, softer, used to signing autographs and shaking hands with celebrities. But in that moment, they were just two human hands connecting. You are, she said. We all are. We just forget sometimes. That's why we need to be reminded. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. What Steve Harvey did next became the most shared moment in Family Feud history. The game show format calls for moving forward. There are more questions, more points to score, a winner to crown, a show to complete. But Steve Harvey wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his own sons, his own life, his own moments of anger and pain that he'd carried. He was thinking about forgiveness, not as a concept he talked about in comedy specials or motivational speeches, but as something real, something this elderly woman did every single night while the world slept. He turned back to the producers. Stop the clock, he said. Not a request. A statement. We're not moving on from this. The studio audience began to understand what was happening. This wasn't a game show anymore. It had transformed into something else entirely. Into a moment of collective witness. People in the seats were crying openly now, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of what they were experiencing. Steve walked back to Miss Dot, and this time he didn't just take her hand. He embraced her. Fully. Completely. The kind of hug that isn't for cameras, that isn't for show, but the kind that happens between human beings when words become insufficient. "Tell me about your son," he said into her ear, but the microphones caught it anyway. And Miss Dot did. Right there, on the stage of Family Feud, surrounded by game show lights and point counters and buzzers, she told the story of Marcus. Her youngest. The one who had loved basketball, who had dreamed of being a teacher, who had been 23 years old when a moment of violence had stolen him from the world. She told Steve about the trial, about sitting in that courtroom and watching the young man who had taken her son's life, barely older than Marcus himself, and seeing not a monster but another mother's child. Another person who had made terrible choices but was still, at his core, human. "I knew that night," she said, "that if I let hate into my heart, I'd lose more than my son. I'd lose myself. So I chose differently. I chose to pray. Not because he deserved it, but because I did. Because I deserved to be free." The opposing family, the Johnsons, who had been competitors just minutes before, had moved closer. They weren't thinking about winning anymore. They were part of this moment now, part of this truth that was unfolding in real time. But then something happened that no one expected. Something that would later be called the most powerful moment in game show history. Steve Harvey reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a card. Not a cue card, not a game card, but a simple white business card. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at Miss Dot. "I want to give you something," he said. "Not because you need it, but because I need to give it to you." He pressed the card into her hand. On it was written a name, a phone number, and a single sentence. "For when miracles need to happen." "That's my direct line," Steve said, his voice breaking for the first time. "Not my manager, not my assistant. Me. And I want you to promise me something. If you ever need anything at all, you call that number. Because what you just taught me, what you just taught everyone here, is worth more than anything I've ever done on this stage." Miss Dot looked at the card, then at Steve, and she smiled that same knowing smile she'd had all along. "I already have everything I need, baby. But I'll keep this. And I'll pray for you too." "I know you will," Steve said. "That's what I'm counting on." The audience rose. Not in applause, not in celebration, but in reverence. 200 people standing, many with hands over their hearts, bearing witness to something that transcended entertainment. The cameras captured it all, every tear, every face, every moment of collective recognition that sometimes, in the middle of the most unexpected places, we encountered the divine. Steve turned to the producers. "I don't care about the game," he said. "Give both families the prize money. All of it. This isn't about winning anymore." And then he did something that would become the defining image of his career. He took off his jacket, the expensive, perfectly tailored jacket that was part of his signature look, and he draped it around Miss Dot's shoulders. "You carry too much grace to be cold," he said simply. The jacket, later, would become something of a legend. Miss Dot never returned it. She kept it in her home, hanging in her living room where she could see it every day. And true to her word, she prayed for Steve Harvey every night. Not because he asked her to, but because that's who she was. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because what happened after the cameras stopped rolling proves that some moments are too powerful to end. The episode aired 3 weeks later. By then, the producers had debated heavily about what to include, what to cut, how to frame it. In the end, they kept almost everything. They couldn't bear to diminish it. Within hours of airing, it became the most watched Family Feud episode in history. Not because of the game, not because of the comedy, but because people needed to see what Miss Dot had shown them. They needed to believe that forgiveness of that magnitude was possible. That grace could exist even in the deepest pain. Steve Harvey received thousands of messages. From people who had lost children, from people who had committed crimes and were seeking redemption, from people who simply needed to know that carrying hate wasn't the only option. He answered as many as he could, but he kept coming back to one thought: Miss Dot had given him more than he could ever give back. 6 months after the episode aired, Steve did something he'd never done before. He visited Miss Dot at her home in South Carolina. No cameras, no producers, no fanfare. Just a visit. They sat on her porch, drank sweet tea, and talked about life, about loss, about the long road of healing. "You changed me," Steve told her. "I thought I knew what strength was. I thought I knew what faith meant. But you showed me something I'll carry for the rest of my life." Miss Dot smiled, the same smile she'd worn on that stage. "We all carry each other, baby. That's what we're here for." Steve Harvey still hosts Family Feud. He still makes people laugh, still works the crowd, still fills studios with joy. But those who know him well say something shifted after that day. He holds moments a little longer now. He listens a little deeper. And every night before he goes to sleep, he thinks about an elderly woman who taught him that the heaviest weight we carry isn't grief. It's the refusal to let it transform us. The jacket still hangs in Miss Dot's living room. And every single night, without fail, she keeps her promise. She prays for the man who took her son. She prays for Steve Harvey. And she prays for everyone who needs to learn what she learned, that freedom doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from forgiving. That's not just a game show moment. That's a legacy.